Welcome to the first in the Decolonization Conversations series presented by the Canadian New Music Network with the support of the Canadian League of Composers and the Canadian Music Centre. I'm Juliet Palmer, the CNMN Board President. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, now based in Te Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. CNMN's membership spans the territory of the many nations of Turtle Island and brings together music and sound creators, producers, performers, educators, and listeners, offering support and opportunities for mutual exchange and learning. Tonight's conversation is led by Dylan Robinson, a Hwalmach scholar and artist of Stalo descent, whose new book, Hungry Listening, forms the leaping-off point for the workshop project Decolonial Imaginings. Joining him are curator and composer Mitch Renaud from Of the Now, special guests Tamara Levitz and Tina Pearson, and participating artists Jake Moore, Jocelyn Morlock, Luke Nickel, Kelly Ruth, Mitch, and myself. I'm very grateful to have been part of this project with its gently subversive approach to unpacking the structures of new and classical music, the ways and forms of listening, making, and being. It's with great pleasure that I hand the mic over now to Dylan and Mitch.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Robinson. Eswelt il tolsquich, tilitzel quats quack, estalk alets. Chiseletzel Haudenosaunee kesta Anishinaabe Hwalmach Equala, kesta Ok Almach Tatha. Just briefly there in Halkomelem, which is the language that Stalo people speak, I said who I was and where I'm from Squaw, the area in Stalo territory that is close to what we now call Chilliwack, for those of you that know BC geography. I'm thrilled to be here as well. It's been quite a number of months working with these composers on the Decolonial Imaginings project, and I'm thrilled to share some of that work with you here this evening. We have a format for the gathering this evening that I'll go over briefly, just so that everybody knows where we're headed to. And we've decided to gather people together in two parts. The first part will really be it'll start with a highlight video of the process where we've been to in the workshop. What else were we doing here in this first part? We will, sorry, is the this outline keeps moving as people add comments here. That's why I was like, what are we doing? So we're gonna have this highlight video, and then we're gonna have some focus time with our two guest speakers, Tina Pearson and Tamara Levitz. People will introduce themselves as we move along, so I won't give introductions to everyone at this point. So that's the first part. We'll have that conversation between Mitch, myself, Tamara, and Tina, reflecting on this process, and they have seen all of the videos of the compositions and the work that we've done. And in part two of the evening, we'll open it up to the composers to reflect on what Tamara and Tina have shared and have a conversation with the composers about that. And the guest speakers will, give some questions and prompts here to the participating artists. And then finally, we'll wrap up with an opportunity for everyone gathered here in the whatever Indigenous lands you're on this evening to offer your own questions and have a bit of conversation with you at the very end. Mitch, is there anything else that we wanted to say in terms of the overview of what we're doing this evening?
No, I think that covers the overview really, really well. I just want to very briefly introduce myself. I'm Mitch Renaud. I'm coming to you on the unceded territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations here in what is now known as Victoria. I also want to acknowledge my production and co-director and partner in Of the Now, Jeff Morton, who is coming to us behind the scenes from Treaty 2 and Métis territory in Alberta. I want to thank Jeff, even though he hasn't been on the screen for the videos. This project wouldn't be what it is without him, so I want to thank him for all of his labors, and then just run through the list of all of the other support that we're very much grateful for this project. The Canadian Council for the Arts, the Canadian Music Centre BC, the SHIRC, Canadian New Music Network for making tonight possible, as well as the Canadian League of Composers. And unless I've missed anyone, and Dylan will be as kind as to correct me, I think we can pass it over to a couple of overview videos of the project to get a sense of what has happened in the conversations over the last 5 or 6 months, and what the imagined compositions that we're talking about are.
Yeah, at that initial point, we were just thinking about a conversation around the book, perhaps with some other artists, and really expanded it from there to make this into a full workshop scenario, which I'm very excited about to embark on, in terms of the possibilities for composers to be in conversation around questions of settler colonialism and composition, as well as sound art practices. But then beyond that, to think about the possibilities for creating work. We're trying in these discussions to move away from an identification that is so deterministic, that X equals Y always in all instances, to really thinking through the specificity of relation.
Well, I bring people into landscapes and environments in order to foster a connection with them, with the hope that that might kindle feelings of love or stewardship or care for land.
It sort of goes back to the question almost of what our position on the land is in the first place, let alone the kind of sounds that we might want to use, but what our individual positions on the land are in relation to our kind of identities in that way.
I wonder how other people view their role. What would you call this?
Coaxing out the imaginations from the audience.
The person in between can be described as the mediator. And it's interesting because if you look at that word, one of its synonyms is conciliator. And so to look at this idea of reconciliation or to reconcile within the context of this conversation becomes really interesting.
When we see ideas of vampiric, which for me also brings back to renderings of capital, and I think time can be a really useful place to resist.
What do we want to model, right? What do we want to model, and what do we want to make present? What is the balance between what we model in the otherwise ways of working, and what is it that we want to make present in re-representing the colonial models of singular focus or focus against the body, that mass manufacture takes part in?
I still have a question about land, because my piece really takes place on land, and then it ends in this kind of rescuing of this piece of land that has been just obliterated multiple times.
I think that in order to break those walls down, there's going to be a need, whether you want to believe it or not. The way to break those walls down is a gentler approach than demanding that people acknowledge things that they're already just hardened hearts towards.
I started thinking about how people don't try to be intentionally like to just sort of sit with their settler colonialism and just be satisfied with it. But there's this weird, awful, dangerous, willful forgetting. People forget where they've come from. They forget who else is there. They forget their own histories. They ignore other people's histories. And those are the things that are like the most fragile, important things to everyone and to our land and to every person. So what I went back to was something that I wanted to start in a safe place and then move out to somewhere that was going to become more dangerous to the participants.
Yeah, so I was doing these sort of personal inquiries about the history of my family, I guess, in parts of Canada since they landed, and what my parents' experiences were with Indigenous people, and what my grandparents' experiences were, and so I was doing this like hyper-focused kind of personal history inquiry, and then also in some ways thinking of this piece in a really abstract, conceptual way, because for me, a lot of the a lot of the connection that I had to reading Hungry Listening was on this very abstract conceptual level. And then I was just sort of at a loss at how to connect these two streams of like the hyper personal and the hyper conceptual.
But I really like the shift that you made in method. So what I'm taking up with the piece that we have in the Imagine composition is trying to think positionality from my own position, rather than working out to these points of absence, trying to start out from where the performers and myself as the composer are. So in this piece, I wanted to find a way to work relationally.
In my current experience with this work, it was about how do I come to know this place where I am as a visitor. And, it's in the description, but as someone that's brand new to Treaty 6 territory, but had been welcomed, I feel I've accepted a series of responsibilities there.
Mitch and I both see this as a process, an iterative process where it continues to unfold through smaller conversations and then conversations at the end again. So as I said before, we can return to all of this rich material in those future conversations. And I'm really excited to do so. So again, just to say thank you to everyone here for your time today and for this really lovely discussion. And I look forward to it unfolding in many different directions through the days ahead. So thank you. And I should say goodbye for now. So there are a number of ways we could start this conversation. But I think what might be good, because I imagine many folks out there watching this right now don't necessarily have the full picture of the process that we took. I mean, it is all out there on the Decolonial Imaginings website. But just to start us off, I thought I might share a couple of things. I mean, of course, as I said in the highlight video, there were two focuses of this workshop process, this several-month workshop process, and one of those was a discussion of the book, of ideas, some of the ideas from the book that I wrote, Hungry Listening, but then much beyond that, think through structures of settler colonialism as they pertain to compositional practice. And that was one part. And the second part was working from what we came to as a group in those discussions, to have each of the individual composers create a imagined composition that was not actually performed. So that was they were offering a recording here of a composition that they would imagine to come about, that could be very utopian, and some of them were quite you'd really have to think about the means of production, but that's wonderful. I mean, and one of the reasons behind that is because it's quite easy within many institutional contexts to have someone say, oh well, decolonization is very necessary, but we just can't do that. It's a kind of yes, but attitude, right? And so one of the potentials of this form, which I should say as well, we have taken from the Imagined Theaters series, which is a series that was initiated by theater scholar Daniel Sachs, is that by allowing us to think beyond the logistics of what is possible in the moment, we then think through, allow different musical compositional models to flourish in that imaginary space of creation. And it's worked that way, really in lovely ways throughout the process. So I did want to sort of provide that really brief overview, but I also wanted to say that something that might not be fully apparent in the videos that are online, that's really important for me to note, is that this is explicitly a process for settler composers who identify very differently, but settler composers, not Indigenous composers. And one of the reasons behind that is I feel it's really important to offer this space to unpack settler colonialism in ways that don't unnecessarily burden Indigenous folks to lead that work. I mean, I was involved, obviously so, but to really work together as a group to think through these ideas And also because I also believe that that work of resurgence that's necessary for Indigenous folks is a work that also needs to happen separately. So this is one of those spaces of separation. That doesn't mean I believe all spaces should be separate in that way, but necessary for this part at least. We made that choice. And the choice was also, just to be clear, that composers should not bring in Indigenous knowledge, not bring in Indigenous performers or artists to take part in their imagined compositions. This really was an interrogation of doing decolonial work that was in relationship with settler colonialism to think through different models of compositional practice. So I'll just say that as a kind of brief background before we turn to our guests. Mitch, did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing before we turn over to the guests, I think we could take this opportunity to play just a bit of a highlight of some of the imagined compositions. And I think that would be a nice set of context before we go into the conversation.
Memorial is a series of questions and conversations that hopefully lead to imagining imaginary sounds from your past. It may also lead to audible sounds should you want to make the imagined or remembered sounds rather than simply audiate. Memorial is not necessarily a performance, not musicians versus audience, all players are equals.
This is the piano action I want you to join. Let's gather the forgotten pianos from across Canada. Let's bring with them the piano stools stuffed with yellowing sheet music, bindings unglued and unraveled, nibbled by silverfish and mice, stained by mildew and damp. They'll travel by train back to their beginning, to the junction in Toronto, to finish out their days beside the tracks in a piano memory garden.
The barge will be pulled by a towboat. The frequency of the motor of this towboat will become the start point of the expression. The cellist and the vocalist will each tune to this note, and as the barge departs the park, will improvise using the bass note of the engine and the 60-cycle hum of the power station just the other side of the bridge. Patterns and timbres of birdsong will drive the vocality. They will begin using the call of the least bittern. The cello instead will build between the stellar's J wah calls and their wet calls. Some notes of interest.
As you enter the space, you're greeted by the name of the piece written on the wall. It's called Gain, Delete, an Unromantic Tale of Desire and Conquest. So you've come to the space with your cloth in hand, and as you enter the space, you do hear sounds, and you see a weaver. The weaver is wearing a knitted garment and is at her weaving loom weaving, and there's sounds coming from the loom. So around her, she's got her electronic equipment, guitar pedals and mixers, and she's creating loops and sounds with the weaving loom.
Begin to listen beyond the score. Listen into the world of the piece that exists beyond the visual notation. Listen to the natural environment of the music. Listen to the music that surrounds the piece, that lives beyond the notes that you wrote. Listen to the sound around the sound you organized. Listen to how the musicians played the piece, how the audience received the piece, and how the piece lives in standardized concert rituals or doesn't. Listen to the piece's future.
The listening of listening envelops the performers as well as the audience through repetition, sound of sound, listening of listening. The repetition of memory that extends as a gesture beyond the situation. Listening of listening over time, the shaping of memory.
So I've dropped the link to the website. All of the different stages of the conversations, as well as the imagined compositions themselves, are available to be heard and viewed there for anyone that wants to dig deeper into this project. Without any further ado, I'd love to pass it over to our guests tonight, Tina Pearson and Tamara Levitz. We're very grateful to have their voices in the conversation and yeah, just carry things forward. Thanks.
Hello. My name is Tina Pearson, and I am a settler currently living within the unceded Lekwungen territory, which is on Vancouver Island, known as Victoria, BC. I'm very humbled and grateful to have received this invitation. And also, I have to admit, perhaps a kind of fear that some of the composers expressed in the conversations, because this is such a huge, complicated, important, wonderful exploration. I have a deep breath of gratitude to all of you who've been involved in this as a collective, and how this collective formed, and to each of you individually. The composer's willingness to honestly and deeply look under their hood of assumption and comfort, and to let your vulnerability sit in a public place. I think it's really so good and so needed and inspiring. And the questions and ideas that were percolating with all of you in the conversations and in your pieces, you know, it was quite wonderful I listened to the pieces first and then the conversations, but it revealed this kind of a simultaneous, over time, dissolving and beginning and blossoming, which gave me hope. So that we can have this more conversational, I think the final thing I wanted to say is I really think that I appreciate this project more than any other initiative or happening or collaboration or program that I've encountered or experienced since I've tiptoed my way into the Canadian new music community. I really mean that. I think it's really quite important. So I thank you, Dylan and Mitch, for bringing it to us.
And I guess I'll introduce myself as well. My name's Tamara Levitz, and I'm right now in Santa Monica, California, and that's the ancestral lands of the Tongva, Chumash, and Kiz. And I am from Montreal, which is also the ancestral lands of the St. Lawrence Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mohawk. And you see in my hesitation in how I say that I'm not quite accustomed yet to saying that, and I wanted to say that. I'm still learning that. I also wanted to say that I'm very grateful to have been invited to this project. At first I thought, oh, I'll listen to a couple of compositions, and then I discovered it was 30 hours of this incredible conversation. And I say that way because I feel you invited me into a process, and I have a lot of strong, attachment is the wrong word, but feeling is also the wrong word, a lot of strong reaction and care and everything about Dylan's book. It's a very important book to me. And I think because it's also led me through a process. I've been reading it very slowly, repeatedly, sometimes just a page. And so that you invited us into this process. And at the beginning, it felt almost inconspicuous, like, oh, they're just going to talk about like this little thing. And then it ended up being so compelling, like the next conversation and the next conversation. And by the end, I felt there was some kind of transformation that had taken place. I don't mean to say that I came out whole. It was just, it was a journey of a certain kind. And I want to thank you for that. I really, really enjoyed listening to all the imagined pieces. I'm looking forward to talking about them. I wanted to say that the process also for me was a big temporal experience. It took time. If you had just posted a couple of things for us to read and like react, but we had to take time. There was no way. And there was something about that that I really found beautiful. Dylan often talks about the temporality of the process of sort of changing your thoughts on settler colonialism. And I think it also, sorry, I'm going to quote Dylan a lot, but I'll try to pull away to myself. I think it also allowed me, and I'll get more into this later, to have a positionality that wasn't so fixed. It's so easy in this work to just, I'm Canadian, or I'm this, or I'm Jewish, or and this process really wasn't allowed, it was taking you in enough directions that you found your position moving. Last thing I want to say before we go back to Tina, I cannot get back to Canada right now because of COVID, and there was a death in my family, and I haven't been back since that happened. And so when I heard you all talking, and when I heard the pieces, there was, without question, because of that position, incredible nostalgia, which I'm sure you didn't intend. In fact, even just hearing Canadian accents, I was like, oh my God, Canada. And I'm sorry I say Canada because I'm actually from Quebec and I could say multiple words, but I did have a lot of nostalgia and even crying hearing Canada because I can't get there right now. So I wanted to just put that out there because it was part of my position in listening to this.
I agree with everything you said. It really was going down a deep process, I think, for us too. It really did take the time, and to me it feels like a beginning. I think you've invited us into something that is a forever thing, and I don't say that lightly. I think it really is the beginning of a process for all of us, and I agree. Reading Dylan's book is also would just linger with a paragraph for a while, or linger with an idea for a while, and let it filter in. I think, and Jocelyn mentioned in her conversation about her piece and this process that it's changed how she sees the world and how she listens to the world, and I think that is true for even though some of us may have gone through some of these processes before. I think the way this has been handled and the depth of it has really been quite effective. I really the form of asking the composers to make pieces but talk about them. It was quite fascinating to me. I noticed that each composer had a different relationship with language. Yeah. They used the language differently, how it sounded in their body, its pacing, the texture. Some of them used that a lot, some of them didn't. The ways they used it in the performance, and I know some of you, what I found interesting too was this kind of almost fragmenting or dissolving of the authoritative voice. Or that I think you talked a bit about this, Dylan, in the book, the confidence of the academic voice, and I heard this kind of fragmenting of that in the voices of the composers as they were performing their pieces, and I was when I listened, I'd listen to them again and just listen to that, and gave me just some really lovely imaginings about not the words, but their bodies and their blood and the memories that might be coming through them as their voices, their DNA, their ancestries, the lands and waters where their blood comes from. And it was a really interesting way to listen without listening to the words. And I mean, some of the words are really hard to, it was really big ideas. So you really had to go back and listen. But it was quite interesting to think about extractionism in this way, and how each person really has been extracted from that. And I think some of you talked about it in your conversations, but extracted from your family, from your place, from your blood, and those memories that are so informative. And I was, I guess, listening for hints of those things in the language, and I liked that.
Yeah, I would say something to that as well, because I the form was very, very interesting to me of imagined compositions. I did find it was hard for them to stay imagined. I was treating those pieces as compositions because had a closed form. They were aesthetically beautiful. Some of them had beautiful microphone effects. Some of them had sound. It was very hard not to think of them as a piece. And also I was sort of struck about the narration. It was so different. I thought there was a real gender divide. I saw a lot of divides. I saw people who were like on a spectrum of how comfortable they felt in a settler position and how uncomfortable, or the men seemed to ask more, do something. I thought the women were doing that a lot less. But the narration also interested me because again, Dylan talks in his book about, I'm looking down at the word narratocracy, that the settlers can have a sort of narrative that dominates the tin ear. They can't hear the indigenous. And I was fascinated that this project led to storytelling of settlers' narratives. It just felt like a dialogue with the fact of a narratocracy. I was very interested in the different kinds of storytelling. It made me think of especially a couple of the pieces of storytelling in my own family. But yeah, I agree with you that it was the piece itself, and the voices, and as I said, actually the accents, because for me they were taking on huge significance because I don't hear them every day down here, and some of them were making me very sentimental and emotional. I did want to mention, maybe I'll mention it now. I did have a reaction to one piece, and I thought it explained something about my feeling of this process of learning new relations through this process. At least I felt that way. It was Kelly's piece. Kelly's piece affected me very, very, very strongly from the minute I started listening. I did not know her work before, so I apologize for that. And um, it affected me, first of all, because I'm interested in clothes, but also the weaving sound was so extraordinarily beautiful, and I was just caught. And she also invited us into the space. Later in the interview, she was talking about a gentler approach, and I think Dylan was also talking about inviting into the space. But it was particularly because she had a moment in the piece where someone sat next to you, and you're sort of taking off of each other's clothes. And I knew I had a strong reaction to that piece. And after it was over, I actually that night couldn't sleep. And this sounds like a cliche, like I'm saying this just for the sake of this panel, but I was thinking of clothes, and it wasn't my own clothes. And again, this really happened. I was up till 4 a.m. And the first clothes, I'm looking down because I want to get it was clothes from an exhibit of Hannah Klaus, who had an exhibit at the McCord Museum, I think last time I was in Canada. And um, she had taken objects from the McCord Museum, including textiles, and she had undone them and sort of figured out how to remake them. And it was the exhibit was called There's a Reason for Our Connection. And even during Kelly's piece, I was seeing that stuff from Hannah Klaus's exhibit. And the reason I thought that was so interesting is I started to think of other fabrics. I don't know why that piece did that. Another fabric that came up was something I saw when I was a kid. So when I woke up the next morning, I looked it up, and it was something that was in the Indian Pavilion at Expo 67. I was 5 years old, but it was very vivid. And the only reason I say this is because that happened in every piece. Kelly's was extraordinary because I decided the next day to listen to it again, and it happened again, but it was much more intense. It was just all these textiles, but they were textiles to which I had a complicated relation. At that Indian Pavilion, my mother at the time bought me an Inuit doll. They were very popular for little kids who went to Expo. And I brought it around with me all the time until I was like 18. I love dolls. And I was thinking about the fact that we have, again, in the spirit of Dylan's book, or those connections to those things, those connections to those clothes, or to a doll that had an amazing fabric. It had that you have this affection for when you're a child, but it's actually an Inuit doll that someone sold in this pavilion. And so you're realizing, oh my, I had a relation to this object, but oh my, I didn't have a relation to this object. And I guess all to say, I'll stop now, is that I thought that was the kind of imaginative response. I thought that the imagined composition led to just an incredible effect on the imagination. What relation were you going to have? And again, Kelly's piece, because there was that moment when she said, someone sits next to you, which hit me like, wow. And then you left Kelly's piece with a message, and I was like, oh, that's amazing. So, but each of the pieces had that effect. And I think I tell that story just to say again that there was a kind of imaginative shifting or some imaginative thinking that I hadn't had before this process. And that left me I was very, very shaken. The next day I was sitting somewhere and I was very shaky. Like, why are you thinking of all those things? And so I don't know if others had responses like it, but I wanted to share that as I felt it was part of what maybe this process at least did to me. Sorry, Tina.
Might just add something really quickly there. I think it's really, for me, one of the things that I have taken away from this is the that form of description, right? How we describe something, which is in this case an audio description, which has layers of, some include sound or space, and there are ways in which I realize certain choices, aesthetic choices in description and in conveying information allow my imagination to take flight, while others solidify that sense of imagination into a really concrete thing. And I was going to say, I imagine this is different for everyone. but those aesthetic choices are similar aesthetic choices in compositional practice as well, right? Certain styles really feel like they allow us to sort of move beyond, to think of something different, and others really feel, I had this reference a while back. I was saying, the sort of what is it, like Vondelweiser compositional practice sometimes makes me feel that I am hostage to the little sounds that are happening, that I have to, and so, but that's me, right? And what does that say about my own positionality of like being held hostage by a sound? So I think it's really interesting to think through this, and we didn't really in our discussions with the composers as much as maybe I would have liked to, but those aesthetic choices around description, how we describe. And I think they were very often tied to event description, right? Like to the thing that is happening, rather than a sort of not in every case, but that sort of free floating poetics of something that maybe lives more in maybe Mitch's was the closest to that sort of moving away from an evented thing, right? But I think it's I think the form is sort of rife for future aesthetic work, right? Yeah. So I won't take. I'm sorry. I want to actually focus more on what you're both saying here, but I did want to jump in with that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good. I just wanted to pick up on. I think we're running out of time for this part. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you said, Tamara. One was about. Earlier on, you mentioned you were seeing this difference in the women's pieces and the men's, and I also had quite a visceral reaction to Kelly's work as well, just from background things. It was really effective, very effective, and I found myself needing to go away from it and come back too. But I was curious about this, and I'm hoping we can talk about this with especially Juliet and Kelly, just because of their small discussion. Around Dylan was talking about in their discussion about labor. They had a long talk about various uses of labor and how we use labor. And Dylan mentioned he noticed that both of you chose to put them. They put themselves in the pieces and to do difficult labor. And what flew out of my mouth was, well, because they're women. and I just found it interesting that, we're talking about Western European classical music. And there wasn't really a lot of discussion about it. This is men's music. This is music that men have made. And I know that all of us have thought and talked and written about it. But I did find it interesting that there was this sort of not letting that stand and not challenged so much. And that Juliet and Kelly in particular really put their bodies into those pieces. You know, their breath, you really felt their breath in their bodies, and they're in there doing this work. You know, women give birth and do this. And I hope we can talk about that with them in the later discussion. I just wanted to, you know, this relative kind of silence, accepting that place. Jocelyn talked about this also, about feeling that she didn't quite belong in that place, and she just tried to be accepted into this Western classical frame. And we do silence ourselves, not just in playing, but in silence ourselves in terms of what that form is and what it is. So I hope we can talk about that later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Along those lines as well, there was I wouldn't necessarily say gendered context, but a focus on distributed agency, right? And the way in which that sort of the compositional choices were, you know, really meant to be taken up as a community determining practice, right? Just as much determining a sense of community as determining a sound or listening practice, which was interesting to me. Yeah, so we maybe even though we did start, so you know, 45 minutes is what we budgeted for this part, but I know that because of introductions we did start a little bit later. So maybe what I might ask both of you to do would be just to give a couple more thoughts to things that struck you, just to give us a bit more, if you have those thoughts, to give us a bit more richness to move into. I'm sure you have tons, as we go into the more individual discussions. Just to focus a little bit more on your responses would be great. Just not a lot, just a little bit would be great.
Tina, do you want to, or should I?
I think it's your turn.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll just say a few other things that came up. I wanted to say that I did find myself, because of the type of visual imagining that came out of some of the pieces, thinking about Dylan's idea of haunting. And I tend to believe a lot in ghosts and haunting. And Dylan has a critique of the idea of a palimpsest. So when many of the pieces evoked visual images, I think because of the imagined composition style, and it did feel like a haunting because they felt like they were coming out of memory. And so I just wanted to mention that I was interested and wondered if others felt that was important to them. I became, as the conversations were going on, another thing like gender that I thought wasn't discussed so much was the word hungry. And, you know, hungry, we do need to be hungry to live. If we didn't know our own hunger cues, we would die. And when people are traumatized, they tend to not eat. And so I was interested that it's horrible to be so hungry you'll harm someone to get what they have. But also we need to be hungry to live, and some hunger is thus valuable to human life. And I was just interested in that tension between from a necessity to be hungry. You must be hungry. Again, if you forget and don't eat, that's it. And the hungry men who came, they were like, were they given food and then they acted horrible? So I wondered about everything around hunger, because it came up to me quite a bit, like at the end of Kelly's piece, because I mentioned that one. I felt this reconciliation, but then of course as a settler I always want this like, oh, reconciliation, and I know that's not real, and so that made me think about the different aspects of hunger. I'll just mention one other short thing. I was fascinated in Juliet's piece about the pianos. I had read an article years ago about the ivory in the pianos, which actually was brought from Africa and was a major colonial enterprise. And at the end of one of the dialogues, Dylan mentioned the colonial aspect of the piano. But it was enough, the ivory in those pianos, which Juliet didn't mention in her piece, was enough for me to feel uncomfortable through the whole piece. Because she wanted to memorialize the pianos, but I was like, remember the ivory. And the reason I say this, because I thought it was an example of those affects that are like an impasse. I wondered if some of the pieces, or is it that we become conscious of the ivory, or someone in the audience remembers the ivory and they're like, I just thought it was an interesting moment. I listened to the piece over and over because I felt that conflict. When she said they come from the trees, I think in one of the interviews, I was like, they come from the ivory. And again, I wanted to say that as sort of an example of this pushing we do when we're doing settler colonial stuff, or like implement tiny little steps towards recognition or whatever it is. And I just wanted to ask Juliet and other composers about that. Did they think about that, the things where you push, or what Dylan calls impasses, I think. Yeah, so those were a few thoughts, but maybe Tina, if you would want to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with the composers specifically about those. I'll just maybe just the final. What was coming to me a lot through this process was, I think especially in the final conversation, there was discussion about the foundation that these structures we're living in is built on, structures that we're living in, the capitalist structure, but also what the structures in the new music, and I think about this a lot anyway, is that there are so many different ways to map reality. And there are the concrete things to me, which are I'm breathing, I have my body, and there things that kind of can't change. But then there are things that can change, and I think that sometimes I think that this, like the decay that Juliet talks about in that piece that you're mentioning, Tamara, that she really describes so well at the beginning, walking through this environment with the plastic cups, and she describes it so well, that these structures have already dissolved, that they've already dissolved and fallen apart, and maybe this relates a bit to the haunting. And what I felt like I was witnessing was composers coming to terms with that it's already gone. We don't need to make it gone. It's already gone. And so now how do we we were up here, our rug's been pulled out from under us. We really need to do this work. And it was like a kind of maybe like a mourning and the letting go, and a kind of all of these beautifully different, wonderful, deep ways of going through that. And I was reminded of a piece by Peter Morin from 2012. Dylan, I don't know if a button blanket dance, a projected river in a courthouse. And that piece changed that courthouse. That courthouse is gone. He had the way he it was a months-long process of involving community, the Indigenous community here, different people, artists, high-end technique things, and storytelling, making things together. Talked about that multiplicity of focus, that kind of community gathering. And then this event in the courthouse, the old courthouse here, where this is where the Lakota people were prosecuted for speaking their language, for having potlatch, and were hanged. And so this was a just profound. I don't even know what to say, the words to say about it. But in the process of that piece, how it was managed, there were projections of the water coming up and covering the walls and covering these cardboard cutouts of all of the judges. For everyone I've talked to who's been involved in that, it might be there, but it's gone. It changed that place. And I think that some of these processes do that.
Thank you both so much for sharing your initial thoughts on the pieces. I think now what we might do is move into the second part, where we invite the artists to join us back in the conversation. And we can have some individual questions from Tamara and Tina to the artists themselves, and we can start the conversation moving in that direction. Does that sound good? All right. Who wants to be? And of course, we've already had a few a few questions we can begin from that as well, if you'd like to.
If everyone's feeling shy, we have a video response from Luke, who can't be with us because it's about midnight in Brighton in the UK, but he sends his regards and wishes that he could be a part of this conversation, but he has prepared a response. So maybe, unless anyone's really keen to jump in here, maybe we start with Luke. So if Tamara and Tina would want to recap some of the thoughts that you sent to him, and then we can play a short response that he had.
Tina, do you want to go? I don't see Tina, so sorry, but if Tina, oh, there she is.
I'm here. Yeah. I'm just going back to my notes.
Me too.
I feel like I've had to write a thesis going through this. Okay. I found Luke's composition. I thought it was brilliant, really. His I think I talked about this earlier, but in particular his very considered use of the pacing of his voice, the tone of his voice. He must have used different microphones or spatializing when he was recording himself. So there were these different, you'd hear him on the left or the right, depending on, and he used those things to very clearly frame different things he was talking about and what he wanted to be considered. And I think that the process of asking composers to take a piece of music that they liked, I thought was really great. It kind of, you get to have a nice, a joy about your piece, and then and then it leads to this really unwinding it and really taking it away further and further away from ownership and from being this static kind of product to completely letting go of it in your catalog and burning the score, that kind of process. And he juxtaposed that with this beautiful kind of poetic image of a frozen music as a frozen cube. And I just found all of that just so artful and beautiful and effective. I thought it would be a wonderful thing to develop and to keep to use in situations. Yeah.
And I'll just say quickly, I had a different reaction to Luke's piece, which I told him about. His voice in that tone, telling me what to do, I didn't react well to. I felt a little scared of that voice, especially the beginning of the piece, like go into the room. It's like, and so I was interested in his tone of voice very much. But more importantly, I noticed in the interviews, Luke spoke about vampire thinking, about sitting in a concert in a Beethoven and thinking of his own piece. And this to me felt like a composer in his head, because at one point he says, think of the score and but I'm not a composer. So I'm like, oh, I better leave this piece. And I wanted to ask him, because I felt there was, again, a spectrum of settler colonial positions, if I can call them that. And I thought he was very interested in what's in his own head, as I probably just was when I was telling you about the fabrics I saw while listening to Kelly's piece. But that seemed very strong in his work. Like, what is the composer? What are they doing? What is my work? What is my creativity? And I wondered about the relationality. I felt the most outside of his consideration, although I thought it was wonderful what he was doing, and I was very riveted and I was interested, but I felt like, oh, he doesn't want to talk to me. This is a composer. And so the voice he may not have intended, I'm curious, but I did ask him about that vampire thinking that seemed to come into his piece as well. And in the very last conversation, he said, oh, I have a few regrets about positionality, and I wondered what he meant. I was curious, that last remark. So that was my comment to him.
I wanted to I think that for me, the piece was effective because it was so closed in to the composer world. And it was directed toward that world and people who think in that way. I also asked him a bit about the master's voice. I think I put that
Totally.
oh, here's the master's voice.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he was intentional about it. I didn't because I was so piqued by he was already using different techniques. I got pulled into that as a sound person. So yeah, and I when he said a piece of music, you know, I was trying to do the process myself, and the one I thought of was a text score from like 80 something, and then I immediately realized, well, that's not going to be appropriate, so I had to choose another one. But yeah, but yeah, I thought it was really quite effective, and yeah, good.
First, I'd like to thank Tina and Tamara for their thorough and engaging written responses to my work. There's an oddness in the timing of all this, because I'm recording this reflection to the reflections from two people, which will be played without me present, and hopefully open conversations that I won't be able to engage with. So hopefully this isn't too awkward. My speculative composition begins narrowly addressed to composers of score-based music, bringing a broader listenership only into the speculation inside of the piece by way of witnessing ritual and communicative transformation. Tina identifies this narrowing as welcome and provocative, while Tamara questions how she should relate as a listener who doesn't compose music and who it exists in relation to, specifically also asking about how it relates to Indigenous people and also how it specifically relates to Dylan's book. I think this narrowing began as a response to some paralysis. Like Jocelyn, I think we showed a similar approach by creating a lookalike audience of settlers, in my case, settler composers. By doing this, I could try to turn outward some of my internal development over the course of the project, or I thought I could try. One of my fundamental learnings over and over again in engaging with this project has been that people hear differently. Even the tone of voice I used to record felt solemn, open, and inviting of reflection to me, whereas to Tamara it sounded ominous and unsettling, which I didn't consider that could be a response to it. So it's it's incredible just to hear how somebody else hears for even a moment. In making this piece, I was responding to Dylan's book chapters on performative writing, and as well as the idea of music existing in a subject-subject relationship, and the ways that colonial listening diminishes and negates these relationships. In my score, I was aiming to create a relational context for existing score-based composed music. And in doing this, I'm speculating on a future that hopefully allows composers of score-based music to, as Tina wrote to me, break down barriers and be empowered to uncover beliefs about role, value, service in their own nicely unpredictable way. So I guess the bottom line is hopefully this speculative piece might have a knock-on effect on the way settler composers experience and relate to music that isn't their own. I wonder about creating more paths through my work for a broader base of listeners. I wonder about further weaving in my own positionality as a white queer man living in the UK. I wonder about destabilizing the linearity of the piece so that the audience is present in the beginning of the work rather than only in the speculative ending. And I wonder about continuing to edit this unnotating process as I grow and change and learn. Finally, I wonder how the other composers in the group and the other artists in the group and the curators feel about the works and whether they would change aspects of them now. So thanks for listening. I wish I could be there and participate in this conversation. And yeah, thanks for everyone who's involved. This has been an amazing process.
I did want to say something there, but I'm not sure if someone else wanted to. Oh, I just wanted to say that I actually didn't ask him about a relation to Indigenous. I was just curious about broader relationality. But also, he made such an interesting comment in one of the conversations about having an abstract reaction to your book, and that was more. And that's what I actually asked him. What is that? And his answer was very interesting. That it was the writing process he was interested in. I wouldn't somehow. That was interesting, very interesting to hear. Yeah.
I'm so interested to I appreciate your saying, Tamara, the response that you had to particular voices and the space that those voices created, or the kind of like drawing in, or because for me, I experienced that Luke's voice there, of course, being in conversation with him for a number of months already. So there was a familiarity of the voice tied to a person, and that relationship already guided how I heard this. But also in a strange way, his piece for me always strangely references Janet Cardiff and George Buras Miller. That sort of, the the kind of, there is an authoritativeness to their voices, both Cardiff and Miller and Luke, in a way that is not a authoritativeness or like the figure of an authority that I would react negatively to, but a kind of like a interest, curiosity, maybe a little bit of fear. Maybe that's part of it too, right? But not enough to sort of be like that, to do that withdrawing thing, right? And so that's for me really interesting here. I want to maybe.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I will just say it was also perhaps in the contrast, because, for example, Jocelyn's voice in her piece was so like very humble and, hi, I'm going to tell you a story, and so juxtaposing that, and then I was thinking of Mitch voices, because we did talk about gender, that his was so aesthetic. Like the rhythm was so beautiful that I had to, a couple of times I got lost in the rhythm and had to go back to the text. But so I think it was comparing, and then you heard this stark, like, look at this, and I'm like, oh, what just happened? So yeah, but it is, and I know that may not have been what the composers intended, to focus so much on their voice, but it became something.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for your responses and for Luke's responses. Well, I wish he could be here to really continue the conversation. But I think we should keep moving also, so that we have a chance to get through to other composers as well. So I'm not sure if we should pick up. Maybe we should. Let's pick up with what was already said. Maybe starting with Kelly. Kelly, I'm not sure if Tina and Tamara, you have anything more to add. Maybe if you have a couple of brief things to say to get us started again, and then Kelly can respond a bit.
Tina, did you want to speak?
Is Kelly here? Yes. She is? Okay. I'm more interested in if Kelly has any comments about the what we spoke about, in particular the reactions to the cloth, and also I think maybe the discussion around labor and women's work, if she had any thoughts first, because we've been talking a lot.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your thoughtful consideration of the piece, and I think that I got very emotional when I was realizing that the tactile element of the clothing was connecting with people. It's something that I've been making my living as a textile worker since I was 16, so it's through and through, and I come from a line of female textile workers from England, actually. My gran in England made her living there, and my mom moved from England to Canada, and she taught me how to sew. So textiles are really important, and coming from a craft practice as a visual artist, craft and sound are equally balanced in my practice. The idea of labor and textile workers and feeling a kinship with textile workers around the globe, knowing that my position is a lot more comfortable than some others in countries where their labor laws aren't as hospitable as ours. There was so many parallels between that and what Dylan's book was talking about in terms of equity, ethics, labor, dynamics between classes that were dominant over other classes, and how people have structured some people into certain classes so that they can oppress them easily, and the capitalist motivations of all that. So I'm really glad that that was getting picked up from you in this piece. The idea of bringing people in to have them contributing their cloth that was coming up in the discussions with Dylan. So having a discussion with Dylan and Mitch about the piece as it was developing was really valuable to me, to be able to draw in and hear the points of contact that they were coming to the piece with. So that was a wonderful, rewarding experience for me to be able to work through some of that stuff with them. I really appreciated that. Yeah. Don't know what else to
think
say.
I think what was perhaps one of Tamara's first comments was about finding there were some although it's hard to go here, but there were some gender differences with how you all approached, and bringing in the cloth. And I think in some of the discussions you talked about, I think you said this, Kelly, every culture from wherever has cloth has found some way to get materials and make clothing or houses or tents or whatever. And I think that and again, for me personally, it was really quite poignant. And I've been interviewing my mother about her. She's a Holocaust survivor, but she grew up off grid in Poland, northern Poland, and we've been talking about her. Her father grew flax, and then they milled that, and her mother made linen, and that was all of their clothing was made of linen, and how they cleaned it so I had all of these visceral memories that came in from you talking about the cloth. And then my other grandmother wove, she's from Sweden, wove the, so I think we all have this in your piece. There is a connection with cloth somewhere, and the weaving threads through the lines, and it was really quite it's so visceral and personal and real. We all wear clothes all the time, and I found that while there was there were some trigger places in there for me too, but it was also, I wear clothes, and clothes keep me warm, and so there was something balancing about it for me as well.
And I'll just say quickly, I'm just reacting to what you just said. My grandfather worked in a factory in Shmorgon, which is now in Belarus, which was a scarf factory. But when he came to Newfoundland, St. John's, he had a scarf store for his whole life. And so there was a lot of resonances. And I only say that because I feel like part of the project is you recognize one resonance and then another. And again, it's this relationality. I just wanted to say, I found your piece and the other pieces like meditations. And today I thought maybe every morning I should just listen to one, like 10 minutes, because it's like a meditation. You come out and what has moved in you slightly? What has all of them? And so, yeah, you were making me think of that just now when you were speaking, but thank you for that piece. That was amazing.
Thanks.
I mean, imagine peace.
Peace, imagine peace. I am actually just wondering now if we should take a slightly different approach given the remaining time that we have. Would both of you mind sort of going through the remaining composers and giving a thought for each, and then we can combine this into responses? I really don't want to cut this short. And maybe we can go over a little bit, for those of you that can, stay with us for another 10 minutes or so. But maybe it might just be better to go through and also allow some of the composers to think through, their responses. How would you feel about doing that?
It would be great to have it more of a dialogue with the composers, if that's what you mean. No?
Sure. Sure. We can do that. We can do that. So yeah, maybe I'm just trying to think about time. I guess that's
Sorry,
what I
apologize. However you want to do it is fine. I'm
We can still do it as a dialogue. I think that'll work. So maybe then we'll move to Juliet, because Juliet's work came up already, and just reiterate briefly something that you wanted to say to Juliet, and then we can start a dialogue from there.
Tina, if you wish.
My turn? Okay. I'm going to try to be brief. Juliet, wow. your writing, I'm assuming you wrote this and spoke it, was so compelling, the way you took us through this place. And I could say some more about that, but I guess the couple of things that came out was, I started to think again about women's music and how you approach your music. Yeah, I'm just going to ask, because I know you'll have something to say about that. And then I just wanted to tell you a little, a funny thing. When you mentioned sheet music, what would happen with all of this sheet music that would be found with these pianos all moldy. I had some vampiric listening, and I jumped ahead in my mind and thought, okay, she's going to talk about compost, and the sheet music could be compost for the worms. And then there was still a little delay, so I was do more vampiric listening, and then I went to Kaggle, and we could do a Ludwig van and have all the sheet music. So I really went into vampiric listening with all of this that you brought up there. It was really quite rich and amazing. So I'll stop there.
And then one of my big regrets was I kind of forgot about the sheet music. And then I was like, after I'd done it, I was like, the sheet music, oh my God. Which I also forgot about the ivory. So it's so strange, because I realized I was reading about the history of these, Canadian piano building companies, and I'm reading it through a colonial lens. They're not, yes, they mentioned proudly of all the Canadian lumber and the Canadian workers and the railway. They didn't talk about, they elided over the elephants. Yeah, so when you said that, Tamara, literally, that is the first time I've thought about the ivory. I feel so terrible. And here I am, Ms. Ecologically aware, and then I just missed this.
I will say though, in one of the conversations, you said, "Oh, there's something horrible under all of this," and it was clear in your piece. And your piece was amazing, but every now and then you felt this horror, like these pianos going in railways out to the west. Horrible. Yeah. So there were the moments when it shimmered through. I wonder what you felt about that. But you said it in an interview that it's horrible, but then you went back to what was more positive about it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. These pieces, like Tina was saying, they draw forth imaginings from the listeners, mind as well. And so when I listen to other people's piece, Kelly's piece, I've done a lot of stuff also with textiles, and I've done a lot of reading and research, and these piles of textiles to me were just horrific. I kept thinking of genocide, and that's where my mind went. So there was a beautiful side to it too as well. But yeah, and the same with the trains are obviously haunted as well in many ways. You think of children being taken to residential school. You think of all kinds of displacement of communities. So that hangs there as well. I did want to just speak to Tina's comment about the gender thing and the women doing the labor. I wondered too if Kelly and I are both people that often self-produce work, and so that informs the way we've made something. We're in there. We're just doing it because we're always doing it, and acknowledging that the reason sometimes that we do that is because we're a little on the edge, and that could be to do with gender. It could be aesthetic. So anyway, that would be a response to that. But I don't want to take up too much time because I know we've got more voices to be heard. So
thank you so much.
I also just feel compelled to say, Juliet, I find the points in your work monstrous. I don't know what it is. I don't like. It's something about the combination of pianos and trains. And sheet music, like all of these things. I think it could actually fit within a kind of horror genre in a life.
That's true. And the RCMP drill hole.
Yes, the serenading and Hannon's going on ad infinitum.
I know. Yeah, it's terrifying. I am mocking coloniality there for you. Drawing your attention to it.
Right. Thanks everyone so much. Maybe just because I see them on my screen, we could, now the screens have all shifted. Maybe Jocelyn, we could turn to Jocelyn.
Okay.
Okay.
Jocelyn, I so much appreciated the way you embraced this process simply, and you seem to use the power of intention. You know, you wanted to be open, your intention of to have safety, of openness. I won't go, I mean, you know your piece, and everyone can listen to this, but I found it really beautiful and appreciated it so much. I had a question for you about the first question that you mentioned. You mentioned it in the conversation that you joined, and this went by really fast, and I wanted to go, wait a minute, but what do you mean you joined sound and music? So your first question was, what is the first music, or what are the first sounds you remember from when you were a child? And I really wanted to unpack that and ask you, did you try the game with anyone by separating that and just asking them about the first sounds that they remember? And also not including as a child, just asking them the first sounds they remember. I was wondering if you tried that.
I definitely did not try not using the words as a child. I had tried saying music instead of sound, and that right away, I decided that was a mistake. It felt like it already put things into a strange direction. And oddly, it seemed to leave out parents' voices and even possibly parents singing to their children. That was omitted. Whereas if it was sounds, a parent singing came back, even though that is music. There's something about it that somehow was more personal than what music meant in society or in this formal way, which is a bit of a shock to me. So that's why it became sound or music. I think that was what I actually wanted to ask, but it possibly could have just been sound.
So you didn't try it to just, you didn't try any time for it to just be sound. I would be curious if you continue the process, what that would be. There are a few other people who have used that kind of approach in different. Pauline Oliveros does it, and a lot of voice work where you're asked to reference back to those things. I think it would be interesting to hear what happens if you do that.
Yeah. It would. I mean, for me, I found that putting the two words together was important in a decolonial way, and that music became less colonized when it was put alongside sound as an equal, although that might be optimistic.
And I'll just say, I know we have to watch the time, but I want to say I thought through the whole journey of this decolonial imagining, the conversations in your piece, I just loved your participation. It felt so humble. And also open, and I just really loved that. And in fact, it was your piece that made me feel be nostalgic for home. It felt like home, and I was thinking about home. I didn't come up as much in the conversations about what makes us feel home or how maybe it relates to all of this. There were so many moments. It sounded intimate and like we were in your home. And also it reminded me of home. It made me the saddest because I'm not home. And then I guess I wouldn't ask about that. I just found it very, very interesting how you did it, especially the accordion. My father also had, I think it was the same accordion. We were also not allowed to have lessons in it. And so there's just little moments that were very, but to come back to my question, I wanted to ask, because you specifically say this is for settlers, and this was the mandate. This would be, all of this is for settler composers. I wondered if any of you, and you right now, felt limited by that mandate, or if you felt if this was for Indigenous and settler composers, you would have completely done something different. I just wondered about how you felt it. Did it limit you? Did it feel like, oh, I wish he would let us, or whatever? Yeah, I'm curious.
For me, it made me think about what might be common experiences for a person who is a settler because we're on somebody else's place. So that the sense of home that we might have is actually probably is conflicted because it's affecting someone else's home. Whereas if we were here first, we're not causing somebody else a problem. So we're pushing somebody else out of their home by having our home.
Totally.
That's that whole mess where I wanted somebody to sort of be comfortable with their idea of their fragile childhood self in their home and go, but this isn't just your home, and look, and it's not just, because everybody kind of goes, well, this is horrible that this happened, but it's not me who did it. Like, no, it's all of us are still doing it. And it's, I don't know, time isn't just forwards, and it's elastic, and we're all doing it. So I've digressed now, but that's
a beautiful answer.
That's why. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I wonder if that might be a nice opportunity to shift over to Jake's work.
I'll start then. I guess I want to start with a comment. I listened to all the pieces, like I said before. I listened to the conversations intentionally. I really wanted to hear you first, and the way the pieces come on the site. I don't know if it's my settings, but they just keep coming. So one piece will end and then the other piece will start. And Jake's piece starts with this amazing splash. And it was really shocking to me. I really startled. And I've been I can't yet because I had surgery, but I'm training myself to go into the cold ocean water here. And I do a lot of lake swimming, and I also take cold showers. So it was that I immediately got pulled into this dive into, the ocean of this depth. And it pulled me right down into your piece in such an effective way. And I think that I know that will be different for each listener, but for me, it was so visceral and so good and strong. And I wasn't even listening on great speakers, but I found my body changed. I got cold. The sense of wetness was there. It is right in there. And then so it was kind of validating to hear that the recording was you diving into the water. That was a lovely moment to hear that from you. And I found your piece to be so complex, complex in such a lovely way. I like how I can't form it in my head, and I like that. I can't. With most of the other pieces, there's a story or there's a completion. I can imagine it. I can imagine how that piece could be made. I could do this myself. I can do with Mitch. I can do that listening. With your piece, it was disorienting, but in a good. It was good that it was disorienting. So I had a lot of trying to find what was happening with the numbers and the mathematics and the histories and your history, and being deep in the water. And I loved that I was immersed from that first splash into this place where I didn't quite know what was going on, but that's what I needed to experience. Is I don't know what's going on. I don't know what this place is. And I think your story about your intention, again, about finding your place in the ecology of this new place that you're in, it made sense to me after I heard you talking about it, and I really appreciated that.
And before I speak, I guess I will ask also a question. I wanted to ask Dylan if we're okay because of the time, or how we're going to, if he's there. Is Dylan there? I just was one.
Yeah, I will just defer to Juliet for a moment, but say that I would love if we could push on for an extra 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Yep.
I mean,
That's fine.
people will come and go as they need to, but this also will be available online after. So for those of you that need to head out right at 8:30, you know, we would love to keep you here
Yeah.
for your questions specifically. But
well, if you want to type your question in the
Yes.
chat, you can come back later and watch the answer. You know.
Sounds good.
So I'll just say quickly, I agree with what Tina was saying. I also found your piece very powerful, and also I can't overview it. Like I can't take my mind through the whole thing and say one concise thing to you. I was very struck by, sorry, always the voice. In the interviews, your theoretical clarity was astonishing. And so it was, you always brought theoretical clarity from multiple directions. And in one interview, you had this incredible microphone in front of you. So I did find that when I listened to your piece, I was imagining that microphone because your voice sounded so special. It had such a beautiful sound. That's one thing. The second thing is, it's interesting with Kelly's piece, I started in myself to have layers of hauntings. Like it just, things kept coming up, visual memories, a lot of things. I found you gave us these layers of hauntings, but like I was very struck by the Gordie Howe Bridge. I've never been to Saskatoon. I don't know there's a Gordie Howe Bridge, but I know Gordie Howe very well. And so it was like a detail. I looked him up. He was, and then so you gave us different levels of how we find out about the spaces we're in, and that was I listened to it multiple times, each time as if it was the journey again. I did, because I didn't necessarily remember the details, and it was because you were shifting registers, I guess, of giving us layers of place. And I found I actually, the second night I listened to it, was dreaming about Saskatoon, where I have never been. And I was imagining these bridges, and yeah, in Paris, and I did not know it was the Paris of the prairies. Yeah, so I guess that's the few things I would say. And I don't know if I had a question. I really, it felt extremely masterful. It was one of the only compositions I didn't have a direct question about.
Well, thanks for listening so carefully, both of you and everyone. It's been one of the most remarkable parts of this project is the kind of very open listening people have been really offering to it. And I'm grateful for your kind of acknowledging the disorientation that was happening in the work at this time as trying to give persistent markers to guide you through it. And the fact that any of those significant markers that were of colonial settler construction and the built environment would actually not help you find your way, but would disorient you. And I think that was a really important thing for me. So I was very much working with the cadence of how I would introduce certain kinds of knowledges and when they would allow you to actually understand them, or if they would become poetics that demanded a physical experience. And so in my work, my work is always spatial primarily. And so I was trying to work with those things. And yeah, I'm in my office at school right now, so I don't have my beautiful SM7B. The 7B is like a really awesome mic for particular voices. Very cardioid, so you always have to have it right in front of your mouth. And but definitely the fact that you've been attracted to the voices in this complete story is really important. And I think that like I personally write about the voice as material, so your responses to everybody's voices, and I mean that in the sort of in the most full way, because these voices are belying a variety of things. And you both immediately began with ideas of gender, but I think there's a lot more belied in those, including the knowledges that people are bringing forward and the sort of the intersectional selves that they're presenting with those voices. And they're very remarkably timbred, and like you've ascribed affect to each of the voices, like the humble nature of Jocelyn's voice, for example. And I'm really intrigued by some of the assignations you've made there. But I think I also really appreciate that you saw that when I speak in conversation on a project like this, I'm very comfortable to bring in the theoretic, but the work itself is experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really important to me that when one moves into the arena of art practice, that it actually is about experience, and it no longer can be what I use language for elsewhere. Even in a storytelling where I'm using language, I'm there using it as material. It's not a message delivery system. And I think that's a really important thing for me. I just wanted to say to my fellow composers how much I've enjoyed listening to the works, and something that Jocelyn said about how you can't make something go away by forgetting it has been really sticking with me. And so that each of you has come up with these evocations of personal pasts when in response to somebody else's story, I think is really revealing. And like from Tamara's evocation of Jeannie Snowball's Ukpik at Expo 67, a woman from Fort Chimo who had her claim to fame in Expo 67. And so that's an example of the kind of weird detail that I like to bring into the story, because it actually opens it up to another arena of conversation. So that tactic that I was using with the choice of the locations, like giving them as numbers, like you would hear in numbers radio stations, as methods of kind of navigation, and the Gordie Howe, and like all of the stories, and the fact that we can't get past the weir, like sort of using the evocations of the built environment as being stoppages, as opposed to actual sites of navigation. But that's a lot. So I really want to hear from other people. Thanks for your interest. I appreciate it very much. The other thing is I'm not a composer, so it's especially of interest to me.
Thanks so much, Jake. And Mitch, we'll turn to Mitch last.
Mitch.
Tina, I don't know.
Okay, you go ahead.
Oh no, you can go ahead if you wish.
Mitch, I had to transcribe your piece word for word so that I could figure it out. I really found it. When I was listening to your, I just listened to it the first time, and I got this sense of listening practice, and I thought, no, because it's easy for me to just slip into that. I realized that the way you were considering listening practice and the sound of sound and the listening of listening was different. It was really different than how I've approached it. So I thought I needed to write it down. I needed to transcribe it. And I guess because we don't have a lot of time, a question that maybe isn't the nicest question to you, but when you're talking about the listening of listening, and if you had to describe that, to your experience of that, to say pragmatically, to say an elementary school class or someone who is English as a second language, how would you do that?
If I was to describe the listening of listening in the simplest terms, it would be the day after a concert, hearing the music in your head again. And it's anew. So it's still a performative moment, but it's something that's happening in memory.
And what I'm asking you is to describe what that is. What is it that you're hearing?
In what am I hearing?
I want to know what that might be. It would be different for you or someone in grade 4 or me. Like, what is that? Like, can you describe what that is?
Yeah, it's very, for me, fractious, and kind of you get moments, you never get the whole. So for me, the listening of listening is really a description or a evocation of the way memory works as a creative force. But I don't think I'm answering your question.
We can talk about it later.
Yeah, I'd love to.
I'll just say one thing. Mitch, thank you for the piece. It was interesting because to me, yours was closest. I think I had some of whatever reaction like Tina, but my reaction was it was the piece that most forefronted form for sure. If I was seeing all the pieces as storytelling and I was fascinated by the variations on storytelling or narration, narration was very a preoccupation while I was listening to all of them. Yours went, I thought, away from that more, like it was very hard not to hear the form. So I started to get into the rhythm and then I was like, damn, I'm gonna have to transcribe it because I have to start again to hear the words. I wasn't listening to the words, and and then I tried, and then I lost them again. And I was wondering if, in that way, to me, it was again closest to the institutions of contemporary music or formal interests or music theory or rhythmic concerns. And I wonder if you felt that and meant that, and also your voice in the same way was fairly neutral. Again, I'm always concentrating on the voice, but it seemed closest to Luke's, to me, sorry to do the gender, but fairly neutral. Um, it sounded like you wanted to have the rhythm forefronted over the inflections of your voice. So I was curious if that you chose that position, or if you come out of an institution and that was unconscious, that's the way you like to talk, or what. Anyway, I guess I'll ask it that way. Were you consciously trying to do that, and was there an intention behind that? Or?
Yeah, no, it was a very conscious decision because it is it's dense, and I struggled over that decision of whether to go forward with that density or to pull back. But the choice to continue was based on that because of the speed of reading. It's kind of the point that you lose some of the sense. So that's supposed to be a performative gesture of the very strong, clear form where it moves in these blocks and you have the division between the two registers. The material within that form has a kind of a formlessness, and there's always a coming apart of the sound that I'm presenting. And I don't know, it might work better as a written thing, but I really wanted that gesture to be at the forefront rather than the kind of the content of the words. And I wanted that slippage. I wanted that it to be a little bit more oblique and a little bit more obtuse, even though it is hard to listen to. And I regret Tina having to transcribe it. I would have happily sent over a
no. I like transcribing things. For me, I think it worked beautifully as an oral piece. I transcribed it because I really, after listening to it, I really wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying. I think that I heard the listening of your listening as you were talking, which is why I guess I wanted to ask you that question. And I think that you performed listening to the listening for me in how you presented the piece. I thought it was really, I agree with Tamara. It was more that I wanted to make sure that in my state of listening with you, because you pulled me into that state, that I wasn't going too far into my own listening practice. Does that make sense? I think that when you're at an amazing performance, for me, the best ones are when I can hear the listening. I'm listening to the listening. I'm not listening to the notes being played. The recording will sound different. I'm really in the room with people who are really deeply listening. And I think that's why your piece needs to be heard through your voice. I just wanted to be sure that I wasn't going into my own listening to listening, if that makes sense.
And I would add something there. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
Mitch, if you want to answer directly. I just want to say that I also really appreciated and really admired what you did. And one thing that came in my mind is, again, from Dylan's book, but also from my generation in Canada, the new music scene, there is value to being abstract or obtuse, like the words not being immediately recognizable. And I feel like we're in an age where everyone wants the words, everyone wants every piece to be like applicable and let's just say it, and everything is very literal. And so I was really appreciating that. And I think I valued that so much growing up in the new music scene when it was opaque. And I don't mean to say you're opaque, but that you didn't let us have the words and let us have the form, I was like, oh, that's because it made me think an awful lot about what you were doing. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Just to tack on really quickly before we turn off to a couple questions from the folks in the chat. I do think there's a lot of power in a failure of a coalescence of sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
I
Yeah.
really like to focus on and somewhere where I like to sit. So yeah,
that's nice.
Yeah, let's jump over. There was a question that came and I failed to record the last name and I can't see it now, but from Mo. There's an open question, and I think this could be spoken to from anyone within the group or as well as Tamara and Tina, but about what we would think if the project was open to reactions of people of color or other Indigenous people besides Dillon, and what we think of would come of that, what we would think of that as a stage in the project.
I think that would be fantastic. I mean, part of the choice for me was a consistency of separation, I guess you could say, right? And to have this conversation, it feels like, yeah, I think that would be really, really interesting to have another one. I mean, that kind of the iterative process can and should go on in beyond this project. That is, I mean, we won't keep going on. That would be a lot. But I think it would be really important to bring in other voices as well as thinking through. We have a predominantly white settler group of composers here that we actually did have some invitations to other non-white settler folks who identify differently. And invariably it was, we're very busy with other work and other projects. And I'm like, yeah, I get that too, right? So yeah, it worked out that way. But I think absolutely getting other voices involved from this point on. And also, it really has made me think about a different process geared towards an internal process geared toward Indigenous folks. What process would we take if it was a process of resurgence, right? Thinking through our practices of sound making and composition. Yeah.
I was also thinking of it being in English. I didn't know, and French. I was thinking. I wondered about if their decisions been made about French, but yeah.
I mean, yeah. We did reach out to a composer whose primary language is French, who wasn't able to take part, but there's also obviously the language divide. My French is so poor. I devote all my language learning time to Halkmalum. So yeah, but absolutely, that's an important aspect of what's been not been able to be included. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a lot of really lovely opportunities for when we make it a yearly thing, right, Dylan?
I love you all, but
yeah, to see the earlier comments about being rather busy.
Get someone to develop it into a university course.
Yeah, wouldn't that be amazing to see this taken up in institutions such as that?
Well, on that note, one of the unspoken conversations I think through this whole thing has been the training process for composers across both just period, not across all countries, but really everywhere, right? That we are so unimaginative in terms of how we teach composition, the limitations that we put on students for learning, right, about race, settler colonialism, other forms. I find myself routinely, unfortunately, saying that for all the creativity of those involved in music, our music programs are some of the least creative places that I know of, least imaginative and creative.
And closed off for critical spaces like this that could really bring forward the criteria in which the conversations are happening through. So if we had more opportunity for spaces like this, I think it would really let us have the opportunity to rethink things.
Yeah. And I don't think it's not a surprise to me that the hardest place to imagine, I mean, this is a space, the music program that I have always been associated with, but it's the hardest place to imagine decolonization and the decolonial, I think, because of the limits of imagination. That's very blunt, the way I've just put it, but I believe it to be true.
But don't you think that's so much rooted in the desire for mastery? I mean, inherent in the practices of virtuosic behavior. It suggests there will be someone outside, and it suggests that virtuoso or virtuosi must be able to respond to others, but will assume a position of leadership. And that there is an isolating desire at the core of this practice suggests that there's kind of an impossibility to it. And I think it's that it's kind of the tricky demand of like wanting show ponies. We do it in many fields, but when we suggest that the real good goal is to be the soloist, is to be the virtuosic, it's not to be the person that assembles, it's not to be, it sort of holds within it goals that are in opposition to relationality. And if we're in opposition to relationality, it just assumes that there will always be an occupation of space, and that will be a privileging of who gets to occupy that space. And given the conversations we've been able to have that look to the core notions of land and understanding that to be in a very broad perspective of understanding. So if the goal is land back, and the goal of composition and musical training is to occupy the most space one person can, there's a core problem. And but in the depth of the larger conversations we've had, and part of this is to just know that each conversation or each composition is not an answer or a solution, but it is part of this iterative engagement that has to be taken into place over time. And I think that request that Mitch and Dylan have put in place for us, and that Jeff supported so carefully, and I have to say honestly, by that I mean full of care. Not everybody needs to witness this kind of activity. It's not to be applauded in sort of like, finally somebody's doing this incredible thing. It's more to recognize that there's a conversation that needs to happen at this level of rawness. And so anything that will assume to take more space for one will not be the way to move. And with that said, I'm going to mute my audio.
I have just, I guess, I think we all have to go. I definitely have to. I guess I have one question that I was going to ask everybody. I'll ask it now. And in the conversations, the idea of, I know quite a few of you asked this, what is my role? What is the role of the composer? And I do this exercise a lot. It's thinking about, if we think that these forms have dissolved, then we don't have the term composer perhaps, but we're all dwellers in acoustic space. We have a proclivity for sound. We're a sound worker. And so if we imagine that the lands and the waters have already been returned or given back, and the redress has occurred, the forms of governments have been returned, we don't know how, but it's happened. What is our role as a dweller in acoustic space? How would you frame your work?
I've always tried to use the term transception, something that sends and receives, as opposed to being an organizer within space. Like you're describing it, this sort of citizenship in an interesting way, but I'm very interested in the idea of it being the two-way radio. It doesn't just a passage. And I think Mitch's work very much speaks to this listening of listening, and gets to this idea that we move beyond understanding the self as separate so much as separation does not mean isolation. And I'm quoting that from this incredible artist, Matthew, I'm forgetting his name right now. I'll put it in the chat eventually, who studies slime mold. and talks about the autonomy of slime mold and the role of the slime mold as a planet, an internet, essentially. But that the species of slime mold will do things that are not for their own protection, that they will participate in the world in order to allow complete survival. That it's not about immediate gratification of the individual slime mold. It's about creating an environment or recognizing their role within an environment. So if one is to be a transceiver within an acoustic space, one would actually spend equal parts listening and in forms of reception before necessarily broadcasting outwards.
And I guess one thing that comes to mind for me, I'm an academic and not a composer, but again, a profound lesson from Dylan's book is this incremental. It's not quite an answer to what you're saying, but right now there's such a moment of wanting revolution in music studies, wanting everything turned over and get rid of everything that's bad now. And let's and Dylan spoke in one of the conversations about abolition, which I thought was very interesting. Abolitionist aesthetics, clearing the ground. So I guess a combination of that, but I really like the idea it's incremental. The little actions taken each day, I guess, as a composer or with sound or with writing or as a academic, that continue, because I imagine there's never an end if everything is returned and then we're all, I don't know if there's ever an end when everything is fine and we just all, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, like even imagine, right? But I also hesitate around, and I know you're not saying this, Tina, but like in everything that is returned, that would be the content, and not everything that is returned would be the experience, maybe, right? Because that to get to a place where everything is felt as returned would be a different thing than the everything.
I think that's what I mean.
Okay.
Like I do, because I've been thinking about this for a few years, and so I try to imagine that, or I'll imagine what if when there was first contact, it was respectful. I mean, I know it's hard to, it seems Pollyanna-ish maybe to do that, but it helps me think about ways I might be inappropriate, I guess. It helps me think outside of the frames that I've, like Jocelyn, I really appreciated what she was saying about being an outsider or someone who's, first generation, a lot of stuff, and then trying to be accepted into something, into a structure that's you're really, it's foreign to you and your family. I think letting go of these, for me anyway, trying to imagine this helps me let those probably inappropriate forms dissolve, and helps me find new ways to engage with the community or with people I work with or with myself. So yeah, that, I'm not sure if I'm being very clear about this, but it's just kind of I guess it's I find that imagining it first is so important for me in anything I do. So I've been kind of going along this path around that for a while, and yeah.
I think that's a beautiful note to end this on, in terms of, well, the project as a whole of imagining otherwise, and where do we get to in the iterations, as well as thinking about really the future work that we absolutely need to do within compositional practice and within music programs and within all of the work that we do, and thinking about working with our imaginations and helping each other with that work. So
yeah, I'm going to jump in and say
yes, of course. sorry Julie. Yes,
no,
you are.
No, it's fine. I sort of the
representative. I'm used to, after all these conversations,
I'm hosting
the
it.
one to end this conversation.
Sorry.
No, I'm not.
I know. I just want to say just such deep thanks to everyone for being here, for Tamara, for joining us, for Tina, for all the listening and thinking, and just I think the generosity that has just flowed through this project has been really moving and has helped us tackle things that are difficult and uncomfortable. And I was going to say, one thing I always love is I had never heard the word settle before, but a friend uses the word settle as a kind of couch. Like there's a settle, there's a sofa. And then I thought, yes, settle. And this is not sitting on the couch. This is not comfortable. So I just, join together on the settle, uncomfortable, but really discovering things together. And yeah. And I do want to add that this was the first in the series that we have focusing on decolonization. And the next conversation CNN is hosting is on November 12th, same time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that is curated by Pamela Atariwala, who's been here tonight listening. Thank you for being here, Pamela. And she's asking, can Western art music ever be equitable in practice and in perception? Which we were kind of getting to there at the end, I think, as well. And then we have other conversations coming up in December with Olivia Short is curating one, January, Remy Sue. In February, we're delighted to welcome back Curtis Left Hand, who was part of a conversation during the summer. And then there'll be a final conversation in French in March. And the curator for that is still to be confirmed. But thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Terry Ron, who's the executive director of CNN, who is behind the scenes, pushing buttons and pressing play. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Kelly. Sorry. And thank you, Luke, who's sound asleep.
Dylan.
Thank you, Dylan. Fabulous.